I'm pleased to be introducing the panel discussion, addressing a topic at the center of equity debates across the city. Time and time again, we've heard discussions reducing the value of public assets to money. But how can we put a price tag on access to the waterfront and open space, or measure the value of cultural enrichment and neighborhood character? To ensure that these vital public needs drive our decision-making process, our first panel on the program will contend with the metrics and methodologies that are being employed to measure value. Please welcome our panel to the stage, moderated by Wright, features editor of The Nation and host of WNYC's proclaimed podcast about our city's changing urban landscape, There Goes the Neighborhood. Kai, thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. I hope we are all well. I am Wright, as you've just heard, and I've started to feel a little redundant saying this, but it must be said, that we come to this conversation in this panel in a much different political context than we expected to be coming to it. And it's certainly in all of our heads on this stage that we're entering an era in which public space and what we value in those public spaces might be deeply contested. I think one of the things that comes away from this election most starkly for me is this question of values. Before we get to policies and resumes and proposals and any of that kind of stuff, we are first and foremost debating what we value, what we think is most important in our lives and in our communities and in our nation, and we are obviously sharply divided on those values. And so the conversation we want to have here with that context is for public space in this city and cities everywhere. Two things. One, what do we value that is beyond dollars and cents? And then how do we measure those things? If everything is measured in dollars and cents and we're trying to value things that aren't measured in dollars and cents, how do we measure them? So that's what we're going to try to have a conversation about. We're going to have some questions from you guys at the end. Quickly, I will introduce my panel and then we'll get started. Jamie Torres Springer is the senior principal at HR&A Advisors, which is an industry-leading urban development and consulting firm. Jamie specializes in creative planning, financing, and implementation strategies supporting urban growth. And he's the past chair of the Fifth Avenue Committee in Park Slope, which is a fabulous organization. Adrien Weibgen is the staff attorney for the Community Development Project at the Urban Justice Center, where she represents community groups around issues related to land use, development, and neighborhood change. Roland Lewis is president and CEO of the Waterfront Alliance, which leads a powerful constituency to transform and revitalize New York's 700-mile shoreline. And Setha is a professor at CUNY and director of Public Space Research Group at the CUNY Graduate Center, whose research and writings examine the impact and broader civic value of public space. So welcome to you all. And Setha, I think I'll start with you.
Okay.
And we're asking what we value, and I gather, I've heard you just say this, it first matters, it matters who we ask, right?
Right, exactly. I mean, the first question is that everything matters differently to different groups. And if we're talking to residents in a neighborhood, or we're talking to an institution, we're talking to a museum, here in the city of New York City, it really depends on who we ask. And one of our big tasks is to figure out a way to ask everyone, to not leave one constituency out, is how do we reach the multiplicity of people? And not only that, how do we reach people in who we ask, but also how do we bring them together to begin to negotiate who should be there, who the stakeholders are, and what their role should be in that decision-making process.
And we're going to get to both later in the day. You guys are going to talk about process, and that'll be unavoidable in this conversation as well. So we'll get to that a little bit. Adrien, let me ask you. So when asking your community partners and the folks that the Urban Justice Center works with, what kinds of things are coming up for folks about what they value from our public spaces, from our collectively owned spaces?
So I think the main thing that comes up actually is this process question. And I work primarily in low-income communities of color that the city and developers have cited for development that very often is not in line with what the communities want. So the primary concern that people raise is just that they can't even get to that point where they're seriously talking about how public spaces might be used, because from the outset, the feeling is that a plan has been made and the desire for community engagement is simply not there. So questions over how public space is used are just one of the many sets of decisions that these communities are regularly disfranchised from participating in. And in terms of what folks want, I think it's many of the same things that everybody wants, like having a space that is accessible and beautiful, and a place where you can go with your friends and family, a place that's free, which is obviously very important for people in low-income communities, and that's well-maintained. And a lot of folks in the places where I work now are really upset that this, in particular, that the city is offering investments in public spaces in their communities now at the same time as they're talking about radically changing development in those communities. So I'm sure you all know that the city has set a goal of rezoning 15 neighborhoods across the city to allow more housing development. So far, I believe all of those communities that they've named are low-income communities of color with very long histories of divestment. And so to go into those communities now, and when the city sort of says, now we'll invest in your park, now we'll make it nice, now we'll give you more money for schools, the feeling of a lot of community members is, what we've been asking for this for a long time, and we shouldn't have to accept as the trade-off for meaningful investment in our public spaces that we are taking development policies that might mean that we're not here anymore. So who is the public that these investments are being made for? Are they really being made for us, or is it a completely different public that's being imagined, a completely different community that's being invited in?
And, you know, so I happen to live in the first of those neighborhoods to be resumed, East New York and Cypress Hill. And I'm a new resident. I moved there over the course of this summer from Bed-Stuy. But in doing our podcast, we covered this rezoning process quite closely. And one of the things that I found striking was that you'd go to the public meetings about it, and this is not a simple thing, because there is no question that affordable housing is housing of any kind is in deep need in New York generally, and in East New York and Cypress Hill specifically. But the residents who were there, and they would be saying, you know, I hear you talking about this housing stuff, but I'm actually really concerned about the intersection of Atlantic Avenue and I forget which street it was, but it's down by the Chestnut area where the city's going to rebuild, and how hard it is to cross that street. And that was where, time and time again, where people return not to these grand ideas about redevelopment. And so I want to press you on how do we. I was just struck by the gap between this very specific need and this larger need that is also equally important in the neighborhood.
Well, but doesn't that get you into the fact that different people do really want different things, even at the level of any one public space? One group may really want programming in that public space and more lights, and another group may really want a very pastoral landscape. I mean, you were saying everybody wants the same thing, even in these public spaces, for it to be clean or neat or safe. But my research really doesn't show me that. It shows me that very different people might want very different things, and sometimes at the like your example, very local, very concrete kinds of things, when in fact the plans are looking in a completely different way. So how do we put those together? How do we put what people are valuing and the conflicts in what they're valuing?
So I just want to respond briefly to that point. So I think that saying that what people cared about the most at public meetings is concerns about intersections. That definitely wasn't my experience in East New York. It's certainly not been my experience in any of the other communities that I've worked in, where there are very large coalitions where folks have spent a lot of time creating a vision for what they would want their community to be like. So in East New York, I worked closely with a group called the Coalition for Community Advancement that created a whole platform of the goals that they wanted to see advanced in the rezoning. Similarly, in the rezoning of the Jerome Avenue area in the South Bronx, the Bronx Coalition for Community Vision has also put out a fairly detailed platform about what they'd like to see. So I guess that's my first response at that point. But
And to be fair, I'm not, and I don't mean to reduce it to that, but in terms of individuals and what these individuals, the things that were pressing on their day-to-day life, there seemed to be a gap between at least the city plan and what they were looking at.
yes, and actually I just wanted to respond to that as well, though, because I think that that sort of bespeaks that to a great extent the rezonings for many residents of those communities don't feel like they are for the residents of those communities, because even the affordable housing that is going to be built under those plans in many cases is far beyond what residents can afford. So in East New York, for instance, the median income is about $35,000 a year. A lot of the affordable housing that's going to be built is priced for people who are making $50,000 or $60,000 a year. And of all of the housing that will be built, so what I just said is talking about the housing that is required to be affordable. And then in the future, there's going to be a lot of market rate housing that certainly won't be affordable to current residents. So when the city engages in conversations around the rezonings, it's sort of asking residents, what would you like to see in your community? And to its credit, the city has put in a very significant amount of investment in East New York. It is bringing investments in along with the rezonings, but obviously that dynamic is a little weird to say, here are some investments, and then we're also going to do a lot of stuff that really it isn't for you.
Yeah. So that the context really matters. Roland, bring you in on this in the conversation around redeveloping all of this waterfront that we have in New York City. What are the things that have come up with folks about what is of value beyond dollars and cents?
I'll take 2 steps backwards. A couple of careers ago, I used to represent ACORN and IEF groups, the Solvinsky type groups, and it was just what you were talking about before. It was always, I was a lawyer, and I was one step removed from the actual organizers, who were brilliant and wonderful, but bringing these folks together, I always was curious to the cart and a horse, which was first, the ideas that the community really wanted from the grassroots up, or what the organizers were implanting or nurturing within those communities. It's a difficult, I think it's an interesting question, and I think there are sort of a priori ideas that are, people want safety, space, housing. These are things that most humans just want in their environment. For the waterfront, I don't think any of us wake up in the morning or were born thinking, I want a beautiful waterfront. Something happened in this city that was actually, I think, with great credit to the MAS under Kent over there, Kent Barwick's leadership and others, started saying something's going on, and we want to have a voice in this, and let's think about it in a broader way. What happened was in real time through politics or happenstance, Westway didn't happen, and a park became there, and that became sort of a light went on. The waterfront was something that was not part of our lives, right? You put anything you didn't want on the waterfront, the industry, public housing, anything you wanted to push away was out there on the waterfront. It's gotten turned around 180 degrees now. So I go to neighborhoods, sometimes fancy ones like the East Side or in the South Bronx, and they have a touchstone now. Why can't we have that Hudson River Park over there? Why couldn't we get something like that? It became an idea in their head. We polled our alliance about what we're an alliance of 950 businesses and civic organizations around the metropolitan area. And access and resilience, these things rose to the top. So we do try and reach out and understand where this constituency is about. But what I'm trying to do in my day job is do what IF and ACORN did back in the day and still do, and other organizations still do wonderfully to this day, is organize that constituency for these ideas of access, ecology, and resilience, especially now in the time climate change. So I'm not sure if I'm honing in too hard, but the question of yours, but it's creating an idea with communities, but really also sometimes, I'm presenting it to the communities, and then hopefully running with them, walking with them, trying to influence them toward becoming a powerful voice to implement those ideas.
But, okay, so if you say access and resilience
Right.
were important values, right, in thinking this through, and those are neither of those things are immediately clear to me how you would tally up access and resilience. So how having established those values, how did you or would you go about measuring whether or not those have been achieved?
Well, that's that's a question that's paramount. We're going to issue. We're in a 10th anniversary when we sprung ourselves from MAS to become an independent organization, and one of the ways we're going to commemorate that is to try and quantify that in a way. Resilience. How many feet will get wet post with a 100-year storm when Sandy hits again? Hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers will. Trying to get that idea toward people so we can quantify it in some way. Not so much to, certainly for equity, so it's making sure that Red Hook and Soundview and places like that will have a say as we try and build defenses, but also just to keep it top of mind. People forget. Access, how many places can you actually, how do you define it, and how many places can you get to and from the water? Right. So, and is it fair that Brooklyn Bridge Park in the front door of one of the richest neighborhoods in New York has that much access, and you walk up and down the river and to different neighborhoods and they don't. So it's a matter of equity. It's a matter of, and it's mostly a matter of communications. Honestly, it's a matter of finding a way, a vocabulary that will break through. All right, your feet will get wet and you can't get to the water, and it's not clean. If I can tell, if those three factors can be understandable, yeah. The touchstone, my goal is the strap hangers. As we were just talking in the backstage about the F train is rainbows and lollipops, and
apparently everybody that rides the F train is having a great time every day. I don't know anything about this. I'm on the J and the A, and we are.
But
I'm the F train rider, but
strap hangers.
We can measure those things.
Strap hangers does a really good job of saying this is a good train.
Right.
This train's not so good. It's clean. It doesn't run on time. I want to get that way for those. So that's
the experience of riding the train is something that Strapping has figured out. Here's a tally. We can measure and we can say.
So it's organizing and communication. That's what it comes down to.
Jamie, in your work, you are often required, in fact, to attach dollar signs to these things in doing economic impact assessments. Help us think through how do you measure, or is it possible to measure some of these intangible values? Well, they're tangible values, but these values that aren't assigned dollar amounts, how are they measured in economic impact assessments?
Yeah, I guess part of my role here is to sort of, because I spend a lot of time figuring out how to measure the economic value and then figure out how to actually pay for a lot of these assets, to sort of defend, at least as a baseline, the act of quantification in financial terms, but then also recognize that it's incomplete and inadequate. And so, I had the privilege a couple of years ago of leading, on the consulting side, the refresh of Plan YC for Mayor de Blasio, One NYC, which was really our first attempt to align the city's planned capital investment with the transformation of neighborhoods that would achieve the mayor's goal of building a lot of affordable housing. Clearly with many flaws and challenges of the kind that you described. But that's the sort of the notion of that you're trying to in some way figure out how much incremental value for real estate, for assets that are privately owned and controlled, an investment or a change in the city's policy or change in the city's regulations generates, and then trying to figure out how you can capture some of that value is a very important sort of bedrock way that we develop our communities, again, with many flaws. And it sort of goes back to, the sort of British development of parks. I always remember sort of Olmsted and his walks around Britain in 1851, going to Birkenhead Park outside of Liverpool, which the surrounding community had taken, divided up, created some lots, sold the lots, and used the lots to pay for the creation of the park. And that's what we do. It's what we did in many ways with the High Line. It's also what we're doing. I do a lot of work on climate adaptation and flood protection in the city. It's what we're trying to do. And I think the starting point is to say, what kind of economic value am I creating? Because if you can capture some of that economic value and put it into the development of these assets, you can reserve your scarce public resources for the things that don't generate economic value. And that's where I think, I'm sure we all agree, the flaw in the system is, I go and make an investment in the High Line because the High Line generates $1 billion of incremental property tax, but I don't then turn around and make an adequate investment in open space where I don't generate that value. Or, and again, very importantly, I don't recognize that communities need to have a way of, not just sort of advocating for, but also understanding and describing and advocating, in a very analytical way for the kinds of benefits that you want to achieve. And so those are the flaws, but I think the sort of bedrock notion that you actually do need to value things economically is very important for all the work that we do.
But is that, so, does that trap you, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if the frame is, well, listen, land costs money, and it costs a lot of money in New York, and so we have to put things in those terms. Does that predetermine the outcome of the decisions in the first place? Does that privilege values that are going to be about monetizing land?
Yeah, I think it can, and I think that there's a lot of risk associated with that. I'll give you a counterexample that we've been involved with for the last couple of years. In the resiliency sphere, the federal government used $1 billion over the last couple of years in something called a National Disaster Resilience Competition, which is basically they took a lot of the recovery money that was appropriated after Sandy and they competed it across the country and said to all these jurisdictions, come up with a project and we'll make an investment in it. And one of the things that got funded is part of the so-called Big U, or the East Side Coastal Resilience Project out of that. When they did that, the feds created this very innovative requirement around benefit cost analysis. Usually with this stuff, you say, okay, benefit cost analysis is how much does it cost, and then what are the benefits in quantifiable monetary terms. In this case, avoided damage to assets, but it can also be increment in real estate value. Then they also said, and this is among the many reasons that we're all sad this week and will miss the outgoing administration, they also said, and also tell us what are the social benefits, the community benefits, how does the environment benefit, what are the economic development benefits, and they even, in this case, to get very technical, convinced all the federal agencies to allow a lower discount rate to be used, which means that you can value benefits that occur way further out. You don't just have to look at the immediate bounce that you get. And so you can do things like that. You can expand the way that you think about benefit cost analysis, so you make sure that you can pay for things, but then also make sure that other factors are represented. And I think
Yeah, no, I mean, so Adrien, does that connect to the work when you're going back to, we're talking about all of the community plans that were developed around East New York and Cypress Hills that are going to be developed now in these other 15 neighborhoods being rezoned as an example. Does that connect in your experience with your community partners that this is doable? What Jamie is describing, that you can start with a dollars and cents cost benefit analysis, or does that not connect with with the kinds of values that at least in East New York you heard from community members?
I'm not sure about starting with a dollars and cents analysis, because I think that, what resonated with me is talking about it is possible to measure a lot of things that currently the city doesn't measure. So I think that there's sort of like the feeling like, oh, it's impossible to measure whether people like their community. It's impossible to measure whether they feel like they were able to participate in the process. That's not impossible to measure. And there's a lot of things about people's experience of living in a community that also aren't impossible to measure. So as an example, my organization, the Urban Justice Center Community Development Project, we have a research and policy team that works with our community partners to do grassroots participatory research. And as part of the Jerome Avenue rezoning plan that the community made, we worked with the coalition in the Bronx to do a survey that asked people about their conditions in their homes, like are they rent burdened? In the last year, have they had serious repair problems in their apartment? Have they experienced harassment and those sorts of questions to get at what are the problems in this community? And the coalition was able to do those surveys by having a lot of community meetings, by knocking on doors. And this is a community-based organization that doesn't have nearly the amount of resources as the city does, and came back with really meaningful data that helped to then shape the plan in the community. So I just don't believe that if community members can do it that well, it's impossible for the city to do
It kind of
it
comes
a
full
lot
circle,
better.
right? That you measure it by asking people who are experiencing it. Yeah.
It's long though, but I mean, what about conflict? I mean, I think I totally agree that we can measure. In fact, that's what we do. The Public Space Research Group really has been assessed all kinds of parks and public space and communities. The thing that I am not hearing is that, again, for me, the outcome is to rebuild our social fabric and to really think about social justice broadly. I mean, I think the Municipal Arts Bill of Rights, I think is really important, and it does give us a set of ideals that we can, in fact, measure and move towards. The question that I keep coming back to is that if my goal is social justice in the broadest sense, that also takes into consideration some of the conflicts that occur even at the community level. I mean, we also do participatory action research, but I think you have to take into consideration also some of the broader institutional forces. I mean, I want to ask Jamie if there is a way. I'm really concerned about the dollar and cents. Can we reduce everything to dollars and cents? Can we, and if we have to do it that way, then at what level are we looking at the dollars and cents? So while we might be able to take a kind of we were talking about before, a kind of rights-based approach in which we're sort of talking about community members and their perceptions, which I know we know how to do really well, and to organize those individuals to develop plans. I'm totally with you in doing that, and but what I also see as we move out of the arena of the small community, a community that has somewhat homogeneous points of view, and where you come into conflict with other kinds of groups and other kinds of goals and other kinds of aspirations and other kinds of rights, that things don't always come together. And that's why I think we need probably a broader metric as well as a kind of rights-based metric. And that's where I'm always turning to Jamie and saying, well, can I measure for my city, for my region, for my neighborhood, can I measure the quality of the social factor? Can I say that I think public spaces contributes to social solidarity? Can I tell you that I think diversity for me over 35 years of research is the best indicator of whether a public space is successful and is working? I get asked all the time, how do I measure the importance of diversity or equity? Do we value it enough? Can we use a kind of public space Bill of Rights to argue for it? Do we not need to assert certain kinds of values like social justice and equity and diversity and access for all communities, and then within that work with individual communities?
So I want to ask
So
Jamie to
I'll
answer
bring-
that,
yeah.
and I'll let you hop in too, Roland. But at first, since it was directed to Jamie, but I also want to remind everybody we want to get your questions. Email your questions to summit@mas.org, and we'll start taking those here in a couple of minutes. But Jamie, what's the answer to that?
He's the money man, he
Easy
said. He
question.
said it.
The answer is I mean I don't know. I mean I know we don't do it now.
But can we do
You know, we as it relates to open space, which I spend a lot of time on, we have our famous New York City, 10 minutes to a park objective.
Right.
Well, what kind of a park is that going to be?
And
Right, and
10 minutes to
we're
pool.
just finishing up the long-term plan for the city of Boston. So 97% of people who live in Boston live within 10 minutes of a park, but some of those parks are utterly unusable.
But some of those
so-
parks
so-
also don't let you in, or some of those
Sure,
parks
exactly.
people beat
So-
you up, or
right.
But wait, Seth.
So I think one measure that it's not well developed as an implementable metric, but it has to do with participation. So I think a proxy for social cohesion is, are people using open spaces? Are they gathering? And as they gather, is there diversity within those spaces that's generated? And I think anecdotally, I spent a lot of time working on Brooklyn Bridge Park, and it has, again, its flaws, and there are reasons people aren't happy with it. But anecdotally, you walk through Brooklyn Bridge Park, it is, the borough of Brooklyn and beyond, is meeting there and is very much integrated there, with some flaws. And so, can you measure those things? And can you measure participation as a proxy for that social cohesion? I think that's important. We don't have the tools that are developed, and when you sit back and say, I'm going to try to develop these tools, it's very hard to figure out how to actually operationalize it, but I think that's
but I think
useful.
we can do it.
Well, let me just jump in. Well, first, for the record, I love Brooklyn Bridge Park, in case I was wondering about a minute ago. I think this, trying to judge the effectiveness of these policy decisions about public space around the narrow view of monetary benefit is a fool's game, and it's the definition of myopia. One counterexample, most important economic development and dollar-for-dollar legislation I think the United States has passed in the past half century was the Clean Water Act, right? San Francisco. You can go around the nation and think about the billions and billions, perhaps even trillions, who knows, of dollars of wealth that's been created because of that legislation. And it wasn't created for that reason. It's created because, God, we don't want Erie Love Canal burning. We want clean water. It was a social good. The other example is the myopia. Including Elizabeth and Newark and every waterfront in this metropolitan area is a Gold Coast. By chance later today, I'm going to Red Hook to see the guys run that terminal down there. Following morning, I'm actually going to see my board chair, who, not on behalf of my organization, but on behalf of his engineering firm, is presenting a new plan for Red Hook that will radically transform and possibly remove some of those maritime uses. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that if we basically are talking only dollars and cents, park is a good thing. Clean water is a good thing. These are, we shouldn't be ashamed of just saying what we used to say, before this vocabulary took over. I've worked with the Army Corps through their metric. They do a huge dollars and cents cost-benefit analysis on everything they do. It's a little crazy. It's almost too much. I just think we should reset about what we're asking and why we're asking it. There are sort of government used to just build a park or build a pool or build things because it was what you're supposed to do.
I mean, is it also a measure or a reality of just it also costs to do the measures, and it costs to go through the process of approving these plans.
Yeah, don't underestimate the cottage industry of analysis and bureaucrats that think about this.
Well, but I don't mean that derisively. And so Adrien says we asked community was able to ask members and ask residents what they wanted and cull the data and create data.
Right.
That to me, just as an expert in it, sounds more complicated than and time consuming and expensive than trying to do a more traditional cost benefit analysis. Is that part of the reason that
Well, I don't know if this is exactly what you're saying, but I think a big challenge that we all face, and look, we can't get away from the events of last week, is the sort of gulf between this sort of elite professionalized capacity to answer questions and the people who look at that stuff and say, what the hell is all of this? It may be fine, but I don't understand it and it doesn't represent me. And that's the sort of deep rift that was revealed last week. And And it's the case here. You know, the sort of, you know, I'll say something I think probably very controversial for this room. I think that participatory budgeting, not in all cases, but in many cases, is a kind of a distraction. You know, where you get a community that you say, okay, I can enable this community to figure out if they want to spend $100,000 on fixing up this bathroom or, you know, putting swings back in this park. And so they focus all of their analytical energy on those things. And meanwhile, the city and other, you know, people like me are making, I'm not making the decisions, but are making decisions to spend billions of dollars.
Right.
And people don't have the analytical capacity to understand. And so I think the key is
Capacity.
the work that's being represented here to enable communities to organize and advocate you know, in ways that where they really, you know, are able to understand and engage with the you know, the analytical questions, and that's what we, you know, it's not a New York problem, it's a national problem that we have to confront now, I think.
I just want to respond to that very briefly. So I think although it is true that a lot more needs to be done to make sure that people understand the finer points of decision-making processes, I think that people understand very well the gist of what the city is doing in their communities and how it does or does not meet their needs. And have very specific ideas about what they would like to see be done better. Just that perspective that people don't know actually worries me. So I've been thinking a lot post-election about the need to name racial justice as a value, which I completely agree with you. It's not just about individual preferences for things, but if you look at the picture of where the city is doing the rezonings, and it's saying that the purpose of the rezonings is to create affordable housing, the purpose of the rezonings is to create integration, and it is only doing them in communities of color where many of the people who live in those communities can't afford even the affordable housing that the city is building. And that, in terms of having measures that go beyond an individual community, that is something that the city could measure. And I think that picture, that what I am saying, that only low-income communities of color are being rezoned, is one that people in every community that I'm working in understand very well, and they understand the history very well, that even though whatever intentions there may be on the city side, the result looks awfully similar to a lot of things that have happened in the past, going back to the Bloomberg administration, going back to redlining, and so I just want to emphasize that, again, that it's so crucial to...
If we were saying equity is a citywide measure, it's pretty easy to say, well, there's 15 neighborhoods being rezoned. How many of them are wealthy neighborhoods? How many of them are poor neighborhoods? And you've got to measure
I think that's really important. I think that we need... I think that for all I mean, I'm totally agreeing with you, but I guess where I'm putting my weight is that we need a better understanding of social justice in a much broader sense, which includes procedural justice and interactional justice, recognition of care, recognition of difference and care, and we need to have a very robust understanding of social justice that is in play at the city level as well as the neighborhood level or community level. In other words, communities can organize and speak up. That doesn't necessarily change the entire metric of what is going on and the decisions are being made at a citywide or a neighborhood level. But in order to move that, I think we need to be much clearer, maybe much more utopian, much louder about that we want anti-racist, we want egalitarian, we want open access, and that these things are thought about in a very robust sense of social justice. We want a just city, and public space is one of the perfect ways to get to a just city. So it can't just be at the neighborhood or community level, leaving each community on their own. It really has to be something that we need to think about collectively and push the city, that we have some goals and values and concerns, including this MAS Bill of Rights for public space. That is something that we all work for, and that kind of comes into connection with communities then speaking up and talking about what they want, because one without the other isn't going to happen. It's not going to happen.
We only have a few minutes left. I have a hard time believing that nobody out here has any questions for these people. Oh, I'm sorry.
There?
I guess I should have been asking all along. Oh, no. Well, I'm
go.
chiding you and I'm the problem. And so I'm going to just start at the top of the spec. How optimistic are we that the de Blasio administration is open to a rights-based approach?
Right, we were talking about that, yeah.
And
Rights to what? I'm actually
Yeah.
genuinely curious what is
We were having, and I think a rights-based approach works very much for what you're saying, that we need to establish a kind of metric of what each individual person living in New York has a right to, and then we could measure it, and your communities could work out what that's a rights approach. My critique of that, to the audience, I guess, is that without the kind of broader social justice approach, citywide approach, or Bill of Rights or something, then a rights approach isn't so robust. I mean, we can talk about right to the city, but what rights, for whom, when, and how? I worry about that as the only approach.
I'm going to plow through some of these because we've got a bunch of them that I ignored and the time is short. But I think this is an important one. I'll try to paraphrase it, but do we calculate the externalities of affordable housing, for example? Not just 200,000 units, but what value those New Yorkers in them provide to the city. So not just the housing itself,
But the overall.
but the people in the housing. Is there a way to calculate that and measure that?
Sure.
Well, I mean,
Absolutely.
at the risk of getting myself in more trouble, I mean, the value is the city's growth. I mean, the city is on target to reach 8.5 million people by probably earlier than 2030, and cities need to keep growing. Within that, we need, and we all recognize that the city that we all know is a city with a diversity of incomes and a diversity of cultures and ethnicities and race, and so accommodating 200,000 units of 80,000 new units, 120,000 preserved units of affordable housing within 10 years is one of the most important things for the city's growth. So I don't understand
see it as
I don't
either
understand
or.
the rights-based dialogue well enough to know what, but that to me that
right to housing.
the sort of recognizing that we have to house people who live in the city. I also will, again, at the risk of getting myself in trouble, I will say, while I'm completely sympathetic to the point of view that you're advocating, one of the problems that we have is that neighborhoods that are more prosperous, more central to where we're sitting right now, have the highest land values. And so you have to create much more density, allow much more housing and other forms of development to be built for every unit of affordable housing that you're going to create. And leaving aside, what are the income levels and so on.
I just need to respond to that quickly.
But that's
not
one of the
true
challenges.
through mandatory inclusionary housing. So mandatory inclusionary housing, just so everyone, I mean, I'm sure you all know, but is a program where essentially if a site is upzoned, then developer gets additional building rights. A certain chunk of the units have to be made affordable. In wealthy areas, the market rate apartments can subsidize the affordable
Right.
apartments because the rent that is gotten from the market rate apartments can pay for the affordable apartments. So it's not true that to create affordable housing, the city has to make huge public investments all the time, although of course I think that is very important to do as well. In some areas, it could create a lot of affordable housing for free. And it's politically difficult, to be honest, for the city to go to the Upper East Side and say, you're going to get rezoned, and it's a lot easier, in their view, to do that in East New York. So I had to respond to that briefly.
I wish mandatory inclusionary did solve all of the problems. Unfortunately, it doesn't. You have built real estate in the Upper East Side, so an owner needs to look at the economics of that, continuing to operate that piece of real estate versus demolishing it and building a new piece of real estate with a requirement for affordable housing. And what the city has to do is put an additional subsidy, which is what HPD and HTC spend their time doing. The additional subsidy required is much higher in a neighborhood with high real estate values and substantially built up real estate.
I think it returns us to the question that came from the audience, right? Is that mandatory inclusionary housing, mandatory inclusionary zoning, for better or worse, doesn't really answer the value of the individual humans
Right, exactly.
and whether or not
Yeah.
we are prepared to spend more.
And to
because
speak
And
because those people are
gentrification,
with
it doesn't include the cost of gentrification. It doesn't include the downside. Again, that's why the larger, again, I come back to that larger way of measuring the overall social justice of it in terms of what it's going to do to the social fabric of the community at the same time that we're looking at individual rights is really necessary.
And I just wanted to note that just the paradigm of prioritizing people who are coming into the city, while there are plenty of people in the city now
Who need
are
housing.
homeless, who are on the brink of homelessness because they're severely rent burdened and overcrowded. And when the mayor put out that 200,000 number, I think that in the media, the coverage is very frequently on the new things that are being built, because that is what is prioritized. It's the thing that's going to change the landscape the most. I don't feel that there's been the same level of public conversation around the preservations, and then to get to
Right.
the preservation, meaning keeping affordable apartments that you have, and how difficult that is, and the variety of ways that the city does and doesn't count things toward their 120,000 preservation units. So for example, they do count every time HPD is able to work with a developer to keep units affordable going ahead. They don't count really when rent stabilized units are kept rent stabilized, because that's not something they feel that they're actively involved in. I'm honestly not sure why they don't count that, but so in terms of valuing the people, having very meaningful preservation strategies is something that all of the groups that I work with focus on at least as much, in most cases far more, than what is being built, because what is being built isn't about making sure that low-income people are able to stay in the city, that they have communities that are welcoming to them, that they have spaces that are culturally appropriate to them because they've built them, and making sure they're able to have their lives there. New housing is by and large not for them.
So, moving on from the zoning debate, though it certainly is the most pressing example of all this stuff right now. A specific equation specifically for you, Adrien, is, I think you've answered the first half of it, which is what are the assets your communities value, the communities you're working with. But the second half of it is what communications would resonate with those communities about those values.
So actually, I'm not sure I did answer the first question
Okay.
that well, so I'm going to
Okay.
go
So
with
go
that.
ahead.
So
Go ahead.
I think I've slipped, this is a panel about public assets. I think I have accidentally slipped into the paradigm of public assets equals public space like a park, which I and my clients do not believe in
See
that
that,
paradigm. And the reason I make the distinction is there's a lot of things that are publicly owned that are not public spaces. So for example, buildings that are publicly owned, and spaces that are owned by a public agency that aren't currently a park. So I think it's important to expand that paradigm, because we have to think about the things that we choose collectively to invest in as being public assets, and I think in a lot of ways we don't. I don't think that most people would think of rent-stabilized housing as being a public asset, for instance, even though as a state, as a city, we've said rent-stabilized housing should exist. So if you don't think of that as something that is a public asset, then maybe you're not doing as much to pull folks in who that is a public asset that they rely very heavily on into conversations like this one. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of this question?
Well, communications about these things.
Yeah, so I'm not really sure that it's my clients who are the groups that need to be communicated to exactly. So I'm just curious. I don't really understand the paradigm of this question. I think that what is needed is for there to be better lines of communication between my client communities and the powers that be, so that the values of racial justice and equity and self-determination for communities that have been excluded from these decisions for so long are really valued at the city level, and ways are created to advance that.
Let me combine the next two together. There's a general question, which I think is a good one, of what data do we need? And maybe applying that specifically to measuring how do we quantify neighborhood character?
Yeah, I think that's an important question.
And I wonder about what data do we need to quantify neighborhood character. And I think, if I'll add my editorializing to what we mean by neighborhood character here, in terms of there are some fairly universal values about what makes a neighborhood attractive and a place where people want to remain. And I think that's what, when we're talking about neighborhood character, we're not thinking about like whether or not there's a cute coffee shop, but the place that where people want to remain.
But part of that is the social relations. I mean, isn't part of what, if you really are talking about neighborhood character and we're talking about intangibles and metrics, again, assuming that we have some sort of city agreement that we're going to be at least measuring the distribution of public assets and the procedures for reaching that, then when we get to the level of the neighborhood, it does matter very much about the maintenance of social networks, the social sustainability of the neighborhood. We aren't always talking about the visual and aesthetics, though in many cases we are. We know that many signs of gentrification are really destroying neighborhoods, and if you interview within those neighborhoods, including sort of commercial gentrification, that change in signage is perceived by neighborhoods as incredibly destructive to the sense of what's there. The loss of a coffee shop because of increased rents where all the neighborhood individuals came together, some of the networks of care. When we talk about neighborhood, I think we need to think about it both as a physical location, but we have to think about it as a social location that is a web of intersecting groups of people that is maintained in a number of very complicated ways. So everything from signage to you said we're not talking about the coffee shop. I'm saying we are. I'm saying we're talking about the corner. I'm saying we're talking about the subway entrance. I think we're talking about place making, the whole notion of a place holding people together physically is as much a social and cultural phenomena. The whole diversity thing is critical for that.
So, but I want to push on this specific question of what data do we need for those things. So like I can go to the Census Bureau and pull up for any given district. I can look at the health outcomes.
You can measure, but you can
rate.
measure it. You can do various Randy Hester things.
What would be some
But what
examples of the data that I would go,
would-
what I ought to be able to pull up that I
You would
can't?
map the community from the community's point of view about the nodes. It's called a Sacred Places Mapping set up by Randy Hester. And you would work with the community to define those spaces that are absolutely inviolate and that hold their community together. And you would have a process that would deal with the fact that not everybody's going to agree on those. And
Let
that
me get
can be
Roland
measured.
because he has much.
Just we have a tool. Maybe it's just a different way of. I mean, we're talking sort of with top down. What data we're going to find out and tell folks what's important to them. We have a thing called Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines to sort of lead for the waterfront. It's a giant menu of a few hundred options that ecology, resilience, and access. It gives them specific ideas that they can use as they talk to stake developers, the city. These are the things we would want. So it's somewhat user friendly. Going to be even more user friendly as it goes forward. But it's just a tool for those communities to say, rather than asking them and these
Yeah,
ephemeral.
but will it establish, I mean, my concern with a lot of the surveys that have been done is that they overlook some of the intangibles that are the most important part of all, like a tree or a sidewalk or a cafe or all of these or the signage or character in terms of trees or.
So is that what
intangibles.
we would be pulling out? How many trees exist?
Well,
It might be.
It's
It might be.
It's an interactive process. We went to Sunset Park, and we didn't have jobs and job training as part of this. And we said, well, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
So we'll put that in there so you get point. It's a point system, and you get this certification like LEED. So anyway, it's just a way
Well,
of.
that sounds certification.
So
Yeah.
I'm so, yeah, I just
Quickly, 'cause we've got-
quickly, I'm
quickly, and I
going to do it
wanna
real
get
quick.
around.
So to me, this question raises like who is the we that needs the data? So the Community Development Project is working with Common Cause New York with the 596 acres on a project called New York Commons that aims to help people in communities understand better the universe of public assets that exist in their communities and how decisions about those assets are made so that they can help to participate and influence how they're used. So that is a type of data that the community members need to be able to more effectively participate in that process, and that's what a lot of what my work focuses around in terms of data that the city needs. So we are also working with community coalitions around the city on an oversight proposal that would basically is asking that the city keep track of how neighborhoods are changing over time, particularly in the rezoned neighborhoods, by measuring a lot of different quality of life indicators, which we're still developing. But some of them include like how many people are severely rent burdened, how many people are getting sent to the homeless shelters from this community. How many people experienced harassment in the last year, how many rent-stabilized units were lost, what is the share of people of color of all races who are living in this community, how is the median income changing, et cetera, et cetera. And much of that is data that the city could pretty easily get, but it's not currently tracked over time. So one frustration that people have had in the context of the rezonings is that when folks have asked, like, so how'd those past rezonings go? What happened in Williamsburg? Like, what happened to all the other ones in the Bloomberg era? To a great degree, the city sort of says, like, well, we don't know what causes neighborhood change. Like, that was a different administration. So there were rezonings, but gentrification is already happening. That's certainly something that was said in East New York. And without getting into a debate about causation, so first of all, I don't think that's true, but second of all, even leaving that aside, you would want to know if the goal is to make the communities like better and stronger through your actions, you should want to know how they're changing over time, and you don't need to know the causation of what is causing the changes to know are you meeting the needs or not. So that's something that we're advocating for.
And if you had that, you would be able to answer what happened in Williamsburg.
Just one other point on all this is I sort of thinking about what in the New York City of the 2020s, and the 2030s, what is it that neighborhoods have to have in terms of public assets, and what do they not have to have, and is there an evolution to the way that we think about that? So to me, I think I'm agreeing with most of what you're saying. Is what matters in a neighborhood is it affordable to live there for a diversity of people? So do they have housing? Can they get to jobs? The jobs don't necessarily have to be in their neighborhood. Do they have access to jobs from that neighborhood? And then what are the daily amenities of life that people need to be able to access in terms of public space and retail? I did see my good friend Randy Borscheid somewhere, so I have to say sort of the arts programming and not forget that. But then what does not need to be in a neighborhood in the 21st century? And I think with sort of so much of existence moving online, and us building amazing assets like the one that we're sitting in, and continuing to build out great public spaces that aren't necessarily for daily use, but are destination public spaces. Not everything has to be in every neighborhood. And so I think establishing some of those minimum criteria and monitoring them is what's most important, and then you need to think of a whole city and of a whole life and the way that people live in this century.
Which returns us to people deciding if they're in their neighborhood what they do and
If
don't
they agree.
if they agree, and we have to leave it at that. We are over. You guys are going to have these conversations all day, and I suspect return to a great many of these themes. Please thank our panelists for their insight. Sorry we didn't get to all your questions, but you'll have a chance to re-ask them in future panels.